The advertisement had used exactly 9 words to describe the situation, and Margaret Hale had counted them twice. Widower, 4 daughters, ranch in eastern Wyoming, need capable woman, no flourish, no apology for the bluntness. No physical description of the man, no mention of age, no attempt to make it sound like anything other than what it was. Margaret had read it standing at the back counter of the Cheyenne post office, with her coat still damp from the November rain, and she had thought, at least he's honest about it. She was 29 years old. She had $17 to her name, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and a rented room 3 weeks past due. The dress shop where she'd worked for 4 years had closed in September when Mrs. Aldrich's eyesight failed, and her nephew decided the building was worth more as a warehouse than as a place where women earned wages. Margaret had stayed on 2 extra weeks without pay, helping sort inventory, because that was the kind of thing she did, the kind of thing that had never once been repaid in kind. She had written back the next morning. Not because she had romantic notions about Wyoming or ranching or marrying a man she'd never met. She wrote because staying in Cheyenne meant slowly running out of options until there were none left. And she had decided somewhere around the age of 14, when her father's store went under and her mother started taking in laundry, that running out of options was the one thing she refused to do quietly. The reply from Thomas Aldridge came 11 days later. It was 3 sentences long. Daughters are 6, 9, 13, and 16. Ranch is 40 minutes from Harlow Creek. I will meet the stage. He had met the stage. That much he'd delivered on. Margaret had spotted him immediately when the coach stopped. Not because he was imposing, though he was a big man in a canvas coat with the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of physical labor, but because he was the only person on the street not looking at the arriving passengers with any curiosity at all. He was looking at the ground near the coach wheel, arms crossed, with the expression of a man mentally running through a list of things that needed doing after this particular errand was finished. "Mr. Aldridge," she'd said. He'd looked up. His eyes were gray and direct, and they moved over her with the same assessing quality she imagined he applied to cattle and fence line in the state of the sky before a storm. Not rude, just efficient. "Miss Hale." He reached for her bag before she could protest, which she decided to interpret as manners rather than presumption. Stage was late. 12 minutes, she agreed. Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like a slight recalibration. He turned and walked toward a wagon hitched near the feed store, and she followed, because there was nothing else to do. The drive out to the ranch took 43 minutes. She counted those too. He said 4 things during the drive: that the weather had been dry, that the wedding, if she still intended to go through with it, could happen Friday with Reverend Cole, that the girls knew she was coming, and that supper was whatever they'd put together themselves tonight, since he hadn't known exactly when the stage would arrive. She said fine, Friday was fine, good, and that was all right. She wasn't particularly hungry anyway. She was in fact extremely hungry. She'd been on the stage since before dawn, with nothing but a biscuit she'd packed herself. She said nothing about this. The Aldridge ranch appeared through a gap in the cottonwoods, and her first honest thought was that it had once been something. The bones were good. A solid 2-story house, a barn that was larger than it needed to be for the current number of animals she could see, good fencing along the near pasture. But all of it had the specific look of a place that had been maintained by someone who was keeping up with necessity, and nothing more. The paint on the house trim was peeling. One of the barn doors hung at a slight angle. The kitchen garden beside the house was nothing but dead stalks and frozen ground. Thomas Aldridge pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake, and got down without ceremony. She climbed down herself before he could come around to help, because her legs were stiff, and she didn't want to wait. The front door opened and they came out. Not one at a time, all 4 at once, which told her they'd been watching from the window, and had agreed to present a unified front. The oldest was tall for 16 with her father's coloring, and an expression of careful neutrality that had clearly taken effort to arrange. The second was 13 and thin, with watchful eyes, and her arms crossed in a posture that mirrored her father's so exactly it must have been unconscious. The third, 9 years old, was looking at Margaret with open scientific interest, the way children look at insects they haven't identified yet. The youngest was 6, and she was the only one holding someone's hand. Her own hand, as it turned out, clasped against her own chest, which was a particular kind of lonely that Margaret felt in a specific place behind her sternum. "Girls," Thomas Aldridge said, "this is Miss Hale." Nobody said anything. "I'm Margaret," she said. "You can call me that, or Miss Hale, whichever you're comfortable with. I'm not particular about it." The 9-year-old said, "What's your middle name?" "Iris, that's a flower." "It is." The 9-year-old seemed to find this acceptable. The others remained where they were, a wall of 4 that was not hostile exactly, but was not open either. The particular defensive arrangement of people who have been promised things before and have learned to wait for evidence. The oldest one, her name was Clara, Margaret would learn. The others were June, Ada, and Bea in descending order, said with the careful flatness of someone choosing every word. Supper's on the stove. Thomas Aldridge said, "Good," and that was how the first evening went. The room she was given was off the back of the kitchen, small and cold, with a window that looked out at the barn. Someone had put a quilt on the narrow bed. She couldn't tell yet who, but it had been placed with care, smoothed at the corners. She sat on the edge of it that first night and listened to the sounds of the house. Low voices upstairs, the creak of beds, wind finding the gap in the window frame. She thought about Cheyenne, about the rented room that had smelled of mildew and other people's cooking. She thought about the post office counter and those 9 words. She did not let herself think too far forward. Forward was a long distance. Tonight she had a bed and a quilt someone had smoothed at the corners. That was enough to work with. The wedding was on a Friday morning that was gray and cold and indifferent. Reverend Cole came through Harlow Creek twice a month and had apparently been informed only the day before, which showed in his slightly harried manner and the way he kept losing his place in the service. Margaret wore the blue wool dress she'd been saving since Cheyenne. Thomas wore a clean shirt and his good jacket, and he stood beside her with the particular stillness of a man enduring something he's decided is necessary, which was not precisely romantic but was at least honest. The girls stood in a row against the parlor wall, Clara with her arms at her sides, June still with her arms crossed, Ada watching everything with that cataloging attention. Bea, the youngest, standing just slightly behind her oldest sister, her fingers curled into the back of Clara's skirt. When it was done, Reverend Cole shook Thomas's hand, nodded at Margaret, and said to the room in general that he hoped they'd be very happy, in the tone of a man who has performed enough of these frontier arrangements to know that happiness was a secondary consideration to survival. There was no cake. There was coffee. Margaret had gotten up at 5 that morning and made biscuits, because she'd been awake, and the kitchen had been there, and it seemed like a useful thing to do with the anxious hours before dawn. When Reverend Cole had gone and Thomas had gone to check the cattle, without explanation, simply gone, the door closing behind him with the quiet of a man who has completed one required function and is moving on to the next, Margaret stood in the kitchen and washed the cups. After a moment she became aware that she was not alone. Bea had come in without sound. She was standing near the kitchen doorway, 6 years old and solemn, with her mother's eyes in her father's face, which Margaret had already begun to understand was a complicated thing to carry. "The biscuits were good," Bea said. "Thank you." Bea was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mama used to make them different." "Most people make them different. How did your mama make them?" Bea's forehead creased, concentrating. "With something yellow in them. Cornmeal, maybe. Or she might have added egg yolk to the dough." Bea considered this with the gravity of a small person to whom food memory is very important. "Maybe egg yolk." Margaret dried the last cup and set it down. "I can try both ways, and you can tell me which one's closer." Bea looked at her with the calculating but careful expression that Margaret was beginning to recognize as the face this family made when someone said something they weren't sure they were allowed to hope about. Then she turned and went back down the hall, and Margaret could hear her feet on the stairs, quick and light. She stood in the kitchen alone. Through the window she could see Thomas crossing the yard toward the barn, head down against the wind. The land beyond the fence was winter brown and wide and entirely indifferent to any of them. Well, she thought, here we are. She found the account book on the 3rd day. It was in the kitchen drawer under a collection of items that suggested no one had organized the drawer in some time. Spare buttons, a broken penknife, a child's hair ribbon faded to the color of old straw. The account book was not hidden, just buried, and when she sat down with it at the kitchen table that evening, she understood within 10 minutes why no one had been looking at it. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were something more insidious than catastrophic. They were the numbers of a ranch that had been for approximately 2 years, spending slightly more than it earned, in the incremental, barely perceptible way that erosion works. Each month a small deficit. Each month the reserves a little thinner. Nothing dramatic enough to force action. Everything quiet enough to pretend was temporary. She stayed up past 10 that night with the account book and a stub of pencil, going through it back to front. Thomas came in from the barn at 8, looked at her at the table, said nothing, and went upstairs. She heard him pause at the top of the stairs and then continue, and she went back to the numbers. The following morning, before breakfast, she put the account book on the table beside his coffee cup. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I'd like to go through it with you," she said. "Today, if that's possible." The pause that followed was long enough that she could hear Ada and Bea moving upstairs, the particular thumping passage of children getting ready for the day. After the morning chores, Thomas said. They sat down together after breakfast. Clara had taken the younger girls on some errand Margaret suspected was not coincidental. The oldest daughter, she was learning, had a gift for clearing the room when something necessary was about to happen. Thomas sat across from her with his coffee and his ranchman's stillness, and she went through it with him line by line. He did not interrupt. He did not explain. He listened, and she watched his face do the controlled, practiced thing it did when information was arriving that he didn't want to visibly react to. When she finished, she closed the book. "You're not in a crisis," she said. "You're in the part before a crisis, which is the part where there's still room to move." She paused. "But not a lot of room." He was looking at the table. "I know the numbers. I believe you do. I also think you've been managing them alone for 2 years without anyone to say them out loud to, and that makes them look different than they are." His jaw worked, not anger. She was learning to distinguish his anger from his discomfort, and this was discomfort. "What are you suggesting?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm suggesting we look at what's earning and what isn't, and make some decisions together." She kept her voice even. "That's why you wrote that advertisement. That's why I answered it. Not to manage the house and leave everything else alone." Another long silence. Outside, she could hear one of the horses moving in the paddock, and the wind, and nothing else. "All right," he said, and that was how it started. She was given no particular authority over anything. This was also how it started, and she understood it clearly. Authority in this house would be earned, or it would not exist. She went about earning it in the only way she knew, which was by showing up before she was asked and staying after she was needed. She learned the kitchen first, because the kitchen was where everything ran through. She learned what was in the pantry and what was missing. She learned that June 13, watchful June, was the one who had been managing most of the cooking since their mother died 18 months ago, and had been doing it competently and completely without acknowledgement. She mentioned this to Thomas on the 4th day. "She's capable," he said. "She's 13 and she's been running a household," Margaret said. "She's capable and she's also exhausted, and nobody's noticed." He looked at her. "I noticed." "Did you say anything to her about it?" The pause. That particular pause, that meant the answer was no, and he was deciding whether to say so directly. "No," he said. That evening, Margaret asked June to show her where everything was. Not in the manner of someone taking over, but in the manner of someone who genuinely wanted to know. June showed her stiffly at first, waiting to be corrected or dismissed or thanked in the hollow way. Adults thank children when they want them to go away. Margaret did none of these things. She asked questions. She wrote things down in the small notebook she carried. She said when they were done, "You kept this family fed for a year and a half. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." June looked at her with those watchful eyes. "We manage," she said, in the flat way of someone who has been told that managing is the best you can hope for. "You did more than manage," Margaret said. "I just want you to know I see it." June didn't respond, but she stopped leaving the kitchen when Margaret came into it. Clara was a different matter. Clara was 16 and had her mother's role and knew it, and the arrival of Margaret was, from Clara's perspective, a complicated thing. Margaret did not push. She moved around Clara in the house the way you move around something structural, carefully, with respect for the load it was bearing. The moment that changed things between them happened on a Sunday afternoon in December, entirely by accident. Margaret was in the small room that served as a study, looking for a receipt Thomas had mentioned when she found the drawings. They were in a leather folder behind a stack of ranch ledgers, dozens of them, charcoal on good paper, detailed and skilled. Horses, mostly, but also the landscape, the cottonwoods in different seasons, the mountains in the distance. One drawing of hands, workmanlike hands that were clearly her father's, rendered with the kind of attention that meant the artist had looked at them for a long time. She brought them to the kitchen where Clara was working. "I found these by accident. I wasn't looking through anything on purpose." She set the folder on the table. "These are yours." Clara went very still. "They're extraordinary," Margaret said, simply, without the inflation that would have made it sound like flattery. Clara looked at the folder. Something moved in her face, something she was not quite fast enough to conceal. "They're just things I do," she said. "They're not just things," Margaret said. "I know the difference." A silence. Clara's hands were flat on the table. Then, "Papa doesn't think it's—" She stopped. "Practical?" Margaret offered. Clara's chin came up slightly. "He thinks the ranch needs my attention. The ranch does need your attention. So do a lot of things." Margaret looked at her directly. "That doesn't mean this doesn't count." She left the folder on the table and went back to what she'd been doing. When she came through the kitchen an hour later, Clara was sitting with the folder open, looking at the drawing, and for a moment, just a moment, her face was entirely unguarded, the face she'd have worn if she were alone. Margaret walked past without comment. Some things needed to stay private to stay real. The first real difficulty with Thomas happened over the McKittrick offer. She'd heard about it from June obliquely, the way you hear things in a household where information moves carefully. A man named Harlan McKittrick had approached Thomas in November, before Margaret arrived, about leasing the East grazing land for the winter season. Good money, straightforward arrangement. Thomas had declined. She brought it up one evening when the girls were in bed. He looked at her the way he looked at things he'd already decided about. The East pasture is our land. I know it's your land. The question is whether you can afford to leave it unused while you're running the numbers you're running. We're not in crisis. You said so yourself. I said there was still room to move. I didn't say the room was unlimited. She kept her voice level. What did McKittrick offer? He told her. It was in fact very good money. Thomas? She said his name for the first time without thinking about it. You have 4 daughters and a ranch with a 2-year deficit. Holding on to the East pasture out of principle costs you more than it's worth right now. His jaw was tight. My father ran this ranch for 30 years without leasing a foot of it. Is that what's stopping you? What your father would have done. The question landed harder than she'd intended, and she could see it in the way he went very still. She did not take it back. Leasing is not losing, she said more quietly. It's a decision, there's a difference. He was silent for a long time. The fire had burned low. Outside, the December wind moved around the eaves. I'll think about it, he said. She let it there. She did not press. 2 days later, he rode to find McKittrick, and when he came back, he put the lease payment on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, for the spring feed account, and went back to the barn. She put the money in the household tin and wrote the figure in the notebook and said nothing else about it. Some victories were better kept quiet. The thing with Ada happened on a cold Tuesday morning in January. Ada was 9 and she observed everything and said much of what she observed, which was either useful or alarming depending on the moment. She had been watching Margaret with the systematic attention of someone compiling evidence, and Margaret had let her compile without comment, waiting to see what conclusion the evidence would support. Ada appeared at her elbow while she was making bread. You're not like I thought you'd be, she announced. Margaret worked the dough. What did you think I'd be like? Papa said you'd be practical. Ada said this as though it were a character flaw. I thought practical meant you wouldn't care about anything. What have I done that wasn't practical? Ada considered. You sat with Bea for an hour last night when she couldn't sleep. That wasn't practical. That was just nice. Margaret kept her eyes on the dough. Sometimes nice things have practical results. Bea slept better this morning. But you didn't do it because of that. It was not a question. Ada, at 9, had apparently already developed the forensic ability to distinguish between performed kindness and the actual article. No, Margaret said. I didn't do it because of that. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then, she cries at night sometimes. She tries to be quiet about it. I can hear her through the wall. Margaret let the silence sit. She misses Mama, Ada said, the way children say the true things directly, without understanding that the true thing has weight. I know, Margaret said. Do you think she'll stop? Margaret looked at her. Ada was looking at the dough with the expression of a 9-year-old trying very hard to seem merely curious rather than frightened. I think it'll change, Margaret said carefully. It doesn't stop. It changes. It takes a different shape that's easier to carry. Ada turned this over. How long does that take? Different for everyone. She paused. But it helps to talk about her. About your mama. It helps not to have to keep her a secret. Ada looked up. Something in her expression shifted. Papa doesn't like to. She stopped. I know, Margaret said again. Ada went back to watching the bread. After a moment, unprompted, she said, Mama used to hum when she did things. Not songs, just sounds. I tried to remember what it sounded like, and I can't anymore. The kitchen was very quiet. Tell me about her, Margaret said. What else do you remember? And Ada told her. For 20 minutes, standing at the kitchen table while the bread rose, Ada talked about her mother in the careful, hoarding way that children talk about things they're afraid of losing. The color of a skirt, the way she'd said their names when she was pleased, the specific sound of her laugh. Margaret listened and said very little and filed every detail away in the part of herself that understood what it meant to be given someone's most careful keeping. When Ada finished, she seemed lighter. Not healed, Margaret did not believe in that kind of arithmetic, but lighter in the way of someone who has been carrying something alone and has, for the first time, been allowed to set it down briefly and rest. Margaret started the bread in the oven. Ada stayed in the kitchen and helped her clean up, and they didn't speak about it again that morning, and that was right. She had yet to make the thing with Thomas any better. That was the honest assessment she made each night before sleep, lying in the narrow bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, listening to the wind. The ranch was running better. The girls were incrementally differently, but the man himself remained at a remove she had not yet found a way to bridge. It was not hostility. She understood that much. He was not unkind. He was not difficult in the way of a man who wanted to be difficult. He was difficult in the way of someone who had built a life around being entirely self-sufficient. And self-sufficient people don't have good practice at letting anyone in. She found him in the barn one evening in late January after supper when the girls had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its quiet. He was mending harness by the light of the lantern, and he did not look up when she came in. She sat down on a hay bale and said, "I'd like to ask you something. You cannot answer if you'd rather." He kept his hands on the harness. "All right, what was she like?" The hands stopped. "Margaret," he said. "Grace was." He stopped, started again. She was the kind of woman who made sense of things, wherever she was. Things made sense because she was in them. He set the harness down. He was looking at his hands. "When she died," he said, and his voice had a roughness at the edges that none of his controlled, careful daily speech had, "I kept thinking I just needed to get through the next thing, get through the next week, get through the next season. I told myself the girls were fine because they were still eating and still going to sleep and still waking up." He stopped. "They weren't fine," Margaret said quietly. "No," he said it simply. Not defensive. Just the word. "They weren't. And I was so far down in it, I couldn't see what I was missing." His jaw tightened. "Clara was running the house at 15. June won't talk about anything that matters. Bea cries herself to sleep and nobody was." He stopped. "I didn't know about Bea. I told you. I know you did." He looked at her then. "I'd been telling myself I'd gotten through the worst of it. You showed up and inside of a month I understood I hadn't." A pause. "That's not a comfortable thing to understand." She looked at him steadily. "No. But it's better than the alternative." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in their stalls. Somewhere in the hayloft, something small shifted. "Why did you stay?" he said. Not an accusation. Just a question the kind asked at night in barns when the usual management has come down. You could have taken one look at this situation and gotten back on the stage. She considered the honest answer. "I've been in tight spots before. I know the difference between a situation that can't be helped and a situation nobody's helping yet." She paused. This was the second kind. He looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't made it easy. No, I'm not likely to become an easy man. I know that. And you're—" He seemed to be working through something. "You don't have to stay." That's what arrangement was for. "I know what the arrangement was," she said. "I'm telling you I'm not going anywhere." The barn held the silence for a moment. Then something that was almost not quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, very brief, like it had surprised him. "All right," he said. She went back to the house. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wind, and felt something she wasn't yet ready to name settling into the cold spaces between the boards of this place she was learning to call something. The real breaking happened in February, and it was June who broke it. June, who hadn't broken anything in a year and a half. June, who had crossed her arms and managed and closed herself down so thoroughly that Margaret had thought more than once that the girl had simply decided to stop feeling things until further notice. It happened at breakfast on a Wednesday, and it started over nothing. The way real breakings always do. Ada had taken the last of the cornbread without asking, which was not a significant event, except that June had made the cornbread and had been counting on having some, and she was tired, and it was February, and she had been tired and managing and unacknowledged for so long that the cornbread was simply the thing the building had been waiting to break at. "You always do that," June said. Her voice came out wrong, tighter than she'd meant, tighter than argument, the voice of something that had been compressed too long. "You always just take things without asking." "It's just cornbread," Ada said, which was true and also entirely beside the point. "It's not just cornbread," June's voice cracked, the way voices crack not from tears but from pressure. "It's the fact that I made it. I got up before everyone, and I made it, and you just." She pushed back from the table, the chair scraping. "I do everything in this house. I have been doing everything in this house for a year and a half, and nobody ever." She stopped herself. Or tried to. Nobody ever once said. She couldn't finish the sentence. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, and the kitchen was completely silent, and everyone could see what she'd been keeping behind the crossed arms and the watchful eyes and all that careful management. Thomas said her name. Just that. June looked at her father with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but some compound of both that had been building for 18 months. "You never say anything, Papa. You never say you see it." "I know you're," she pressed her mouth together. "I know you're trying. But I get up every morning, and I don't know if I'm doing it right, and you never. She stopped because her voice had given out on her. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Margaret could see, watching him, the same thing she'd seen in the barn in January. A man confronting himself clearly and not enjoying the view. He pushed back from the table. He crossed the kitchen, 4 steps, not many, and he put his arm around June's shoulders, and June, who was 13 and had been trying very hard not to need anyone, made a small sound and leaned into her father's side and cried. Not elegantly, not quietly, the real kind. Thomas held her and said nothing, which was what the moment needed. Margaret looked at the table. She looked at Ada, who was watching with her mouth slightly open. She looked at Bea, who had climbed off her chair and was pressing herself against her father's leg, one hand gripping his jacket. After a while, June pulled back. She wiped her face with her sleeve in the rough, practical way of someone who is embarrassed by their own tears, but not willing to hide that they happened. She looked at her father. "I miss her," she said, plainly, like something she had needed to say for a very long time. "I know," Thomas said, and then, with a difficulty that was visible in every syllable, "So do I." Margaret got up and went to the stove and stayed there, busy with the coffee and the morning, present but out of the way. Clara, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway this whole time without anyone noticing, came and stood beside her at the stove, and they both looked at the coffee rather than at the family behind them. After a moment, Clara said, very quietly, so only Margaret could hear, "He doesn't do that. He doesn't." She stopped. "He hasn't cried since the funeral." Margaret kept her eyes on the coffee. She didn't say anything. "What did you say to him?" Clara said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "In January, in the barn, nothing he didn't already know." Clara was quiet. "Then, how did you know to say it?" Margaret thought about this. She thought about a kitchen in Cheyenne in October, sitting with the newspaper, with a post office address and a broken clasp on her bag, and $17 and no more options. She thought about the 9 words and what she'd understood about them. That a man who doesn't ask for much is usually a man who doesn't know how to ask at all. "I recognized it," she said. "That's all." Clara stood beside her for another moment. Then she went back to the table and sat down with her sisters and her father, and they had their breakfast, and nobody talked about what had happened. But the temperature in the room was different, and Margaret knew the difference. By March, the ranch had a different sound. Not dramatically. She would not have described it to anyone as transformed because it wasn't. The work was still the same work. Thomas was still more silence than speech. The East pasture lease money had helped, but only helped. There were still months ahead of careful management before the numbers breathed easy. Clara still carried her role in the house. June still crossed her arms sometimes, though less often, and sometimes didn't cross them at all. But the sound had changed. There was noise in it that hadn't been there before. Not noise, something more specific than that. Ada's voice, constant and cataloging, but landing differently now because someone was answering her. The particular sound of Bea sleeping through the night, which Margaret could hear, or rather not hear, through the thin wall between their rooms. Thomas asking June at dinner what she'd done that day with the specific, effortful quality of a man practicing something he isn't yet good at. June answering him first in 1 word, then in 2, then one evening at the end of March in a full sentence that required a follow-up, and the conversation lasting tentatively all the way through supper. One evening in late March, she came into the parlor to find Clara sitting with the leather folder open in her lap and Thomas sitting in the chair beside her, not quite looking at the drawings but positioned so that he could. And Clara was explaining something. Margaret couldn't hear what, with a particular animation that she'd never seen in the girl before. She kept moving, but she carried that image with her for the rest of the evening, and it sat differently than anything else she'd seen since September. Spring arrived in April, unannounced and entirely welcome. The frozen kitchen garden began to suggest life at its edges, not the polite, tentative suggestion of a normal spring, but the insistent, slightly aggressive return of things with deep enough roots to have waited out the winter intact. Margaret was in the garden on the first real warm morning when Bea found her. Bea had developed the habit of finding her, tracking her through the house and yard with the homing instinct of a small animal who has decided where safety is. She came and stood at the garden's edge and watched. "Ada says you're going to plant flowers," Bea said. "Vegetables first, flowers after if there's room. Mama had flowers." Bea said it in the simple, unweighted way she talked about her mother now. Not carefully, not braced for the grief of it, just as fact. They had worked toward this slowly, she and Bea, over the winter. A few words here, a memory there, until the memories had stopped being to protect and started being something to carry easily. By the window. Yellow ones. What kind? Bea considered. Big and yellow sunflowers, maybe. Or black-eyed Susans. Bea nodded seriously. We should plant those. We should, Margaret agreed. Will you help me figure out where? Bea came through the garden gate with the gravity of someone accepting an important commission, and they walked the rows together, and she pointed at places with the authority of a 6-year-old who has decided something matters. Thomas found her there that evening, after the girls had gone in for supper. He came and stood at the garden gate, his coat unbuttoned, his face carrying the day's work, and something else she'd been watching accumulate in him over these months. Something more open than what he'd had in November, less defended. Still not easy. She did not expect easy. Bea says you're planting sunflowers, he said. She has opinions about placement. She has opinions about most things. Something warm in the dry way he said it. A man talking about a daughter he was learning again to see. She finished tamping down the soil and straightened. The evening light was long and gold across the pasture, the kind of light that belonged specifically to spring in this kind of country and nowhere else. I want to say something, Thomas said. I may not say it well. She waited. When I put that advertisement in the paper, he said, I was trying to solve a problem. I was very clear with myself about that. I wasn't looking for. He stopped, started again. I've been a closed-off man for 2 years, and before that, I wasn't always easy, and I know that. He looked at the fence post rather than at her, the way he looked at things when the words were coming from somewhere that cost him. But something has changed in this house, and it's not the ledger, and it's not the kitchen, and it's not the East pasture lease. He stopped. You can say it, she said, quietly. He looked at her then. It's you, he said. The change is you. The way you came in and you didn't ask permission. You just showed up and started paying attention. And you didn't stop when things were hard. And you, his voice roughened. My daughters are different. I'm different. And I spent a long time telling myself this was a practical arrangement, and that's all. And I've stopped being able to tell myself that and believe it. The garden was very still around them. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a bird. What are you telling yourself now, she said. He held her gaze. That I'd like to do better by you than I have. That I'd like this to be. He was looking for the word. More than what I advertised. She thought about what she'd known in November and what she knew now. She thought about the account book and the cornbread and June's voice cracking and Bea in the garden pointing at places for sunflowers. She thought about a man sitting beside his daughter looking at drawings he'd never asked to see before. She thought about the barn in January, and the almost smile, the almost. It already is, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not the controlled management, not the professional flatness, but the actual face of him, present and unguarded. He nodded, once, with the particular quality he had of meaning what he'd committed to. Good, he said. They walked back to the house together, not quite touching, but side by side. And the door opened before they reached it, because Ada had been watching from the window as she watched everything, and was already going back to set the table. The supper table in May held different things than it had in November. Same wood, same chairs, same window looking out over the same land. But it held different things. Thomas at the head asking questions and staying for the answers. Clara with her folder on the sideboard, the one she'd stopped hiding. June with her arms uncrossed. Ada reporting on the day's events with the thoroughness of a correspondent and expecting responses. Bea beside Margaret, close enough that their elbows touched, eating with the comfortable unconsciousness of a child who has decided where she belongs. After supper, when the dishes were done and the girls had scattered to the evening's business, Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without being asked. He sat down across the table. They did that sometimes now, sat in the kitchen in the evening without particular purpose, just present in the same space, which was its own kind of conversation. Clara asked me today, he said, if she could take a correspondence course. Drawing. There's a school in Denver does them by mail. Margaret looked at him. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. What are you thinking? He turned the cup in his hands. I'm thinking I've been telling myself that practical is the same as wise. And I'm not sure that's true anymore. She held his gaze. It isn't the same thing. He nodded slowly. She's talented. I should have seen it sooner. You see it now, she said. That's what matters. He looked at her in the quiet kitchen, and the evening light was still going outside, and the land was green where it had been frozen. And from somewhere upstairs she could hear Ada explaining something at length to Bea, who was responding with the solemnity of someone trying to keep up, and it was loud and imperfect and entirely real. I'm glad you answered that letter, Thomas said. She had been called a lot of things in her life, and thanked in a lot of ways, and she had learned to distinguish between the hollow kind and the kind that comes from somewhere actual. This was the actual kind. She picked up her coffee. So am I, she said. Outside, the spring evening went on doing what spring evenings do in Wyoming, going long and gold and indifferent and beautiful all at once, not caring whether anyone was watching, but being watched anyway by two people sitting in a kitchen with their coffee and four girls living their ordinary, imperfect, gradually unlocking lives above their heads. It was not the life Margaret Hale had planned. She had learned in the months since November that this was not a relevant objection. The life you plan and the life that opens in front of you are rarely the same country, and the ones that ask the most of you are rarely the ones you'd have chosen. But she had stayed. That was what she had said to Bea in the garden, and it was what she'd said to herself every morning since November, and it was still true. She had stayed, and they had let her, and out of that simple and difficult and entirely ordinary thing, something had been built that none of them had had the words for in the beginning. They had the words for it now. They were sitting at a kitchen table in Wyoming in the spring, with sunflowers planned for the garden, and a drawing course ordered from Denver, and a man who had learned, late and imperfectly, and with considerable effort, to stay in the room when things got hard. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.